webinar today with Dr. Amir Lebdioui from the London School of Economics. This event is organized by the Center for the Study of International Economic Relations and the Center for Industrial Economics and Technology, both at the Institute of Economics of the University of Campinas. Dr. Amir Lebdioui is a fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he leads the Canning House research agenda on the future of trade and green growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Amir's research also examines the interplay between industrial policy, natural resource management, climate change, and sustainable development agenda. He's also an affiliated lecturer in development studies at the University of Cambridge and an associate at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. We regularly carries out research and consultancies for international development organizations such as UNCTAD and the International Renewable Energy Agency. He holds also a PhD in development studies from the University of Cambridge, UK. So it's a great pleasure to receive you today, Amir. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation on behalf of the whole community of the Institute of Economics at the University of Campinas. It's a pleasure to discuss this topic, which is from fiscal stabilization to economic diversification, a developmental approach to managing resource revenues. This presentation is also based on a paper co-authored with Professor Ha-Joon Chang from the University of Cambridge. So Amir, it's again a pleasure to have you here today. The word is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for the kind invitation and by the Center for the Study of International Economic Relations and the Center for Industrial Economics and Technology. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be able to engage with the economists at Campinas and exchange ideas. I'll try to keep the presentation relatively short so that we can have a discussion afterwards. So this presentation is presenting the work that you mentioned on how to manage natural resource revenues to achieve economic diversification objectives. So depending on the audience, sometimes there is a interest for kind of explaining why. So what are the risks of commodity dependence and why is economic diversification objectives? Sometimes not, but just in case, I'm still going to start this presentation by presenting what we can consider as, let's say, horror stories of development economics. So I'm going to start by recalling the experience of this small island country, Nauru, located in the Pacific, which used to be the richest nation on Earth in the 1970s, right? With a GDP per capita way over $20,000. So with most of this was fueled by phosphate extraction. They used the money basically not so well, and as you can see, to import Rolls-Royce. And basically 30 years down the line, this is Nauru. This is the country, the luxury cars of the past are now basically they're rotting, and this is a visual snapshot of the island, which is basically destroyed. This is because of several things. First, the phosphate deposits ran out. And on top of things, phosphate extraction led to environmental degradation, which destroyed the country's agricultural potential. So then they were left with nothing to export, and the country was at the brink of bankruptcy in the early 2000s. The case of Nauru is unfortunately not unique. Across history, there are several episodes of these shocks that are indirectly or directly induced by commodity dependence. Another famous case is the case of Chile, which used to export natural nitrate. But a German scientist called Fritz Haber then figured out how to synthesize nitrate. And from one day to the other, Chile's exports became virtually worth nothing. And the country plunged into a crisis. And one of the messages of this presentation, and it's something that I will actually go back to at the end, is that this is not unique. There will be many more Fritz Habers to come. And that's why these countries need to be prepared. And prepared by investing revenues, not just, so basically just putting your money in financial assets won't help you deal with this type of crisis. Instead, there's a need to invest in productive capabilities to ensure other sources of income once non-renewable resources run out. And if you're still not convinced by the vagaries of commodity dependence, then I will add this graph borrowed from two IMF economists, Reda Sharif and Fouad Hazanov, who showed that oil-dependent countries, even the rich states of the Gulf, they've actually experienced a relative income decline since the 70s. So now, in this context, the question that is raised is, but how, concretely, how can commodity-dependent countries diversify their economies? What are the different pathways? So this is actually borrowed from my PhD thesis, just to kind of contextualize the bulk of the presentation and the paper that was co-written with Ha-Joon Chang. So this is a taxonomy of diversification strategies, showing that there are three main diversification pathways arising out of commodity dependence. The first one is vertical diversification, so both upstream and downstream. For example, if you produce oil, so upstream diversification would be the localization of all the machinery and equipment that is used for oil extraction. So in the case of Brazil, I heard that Brazilians are very good at offshore technology to extract oil. So this would be kind of an example of, and now exports this technology abroad. So this would be a case of upstream diversification. Downstream diversification would be value addition to transform the raw material into different sets of products. So from oil, the opportunities are actually endless, from to petrochemicals to plastics and so on, or energy-intensive industries. But besides vertical diversification, there's also horizontal diversification, so diversification towards new sectors outside of the commodity value chain. But here is the horizontal diversification is divided between unrelated and related diversification. So by related, what I mean by that is the types of sectors that leverage capabilities that are embedded in the commodity, embedded in the commodity value chain, but that can be applied towards new sectors. For example, the knowledge, technological, and organization skills that can be applied elsewhere in infrastructure, or just products that have a wider applicability for other sectors. So again, in the case of oil extraction in Brazil, we can think of the knowledge and expertise in offshore oil extraction could potentially be applied for offshore wind energy, right? So there's some kind of expertise and knowledge that can be used for diversification. In that case, even for clean tech. And related diversification would be the diversification into sectors that are unrelated to commodities, although the truth is there's nothing as possible as complete unrelatedness, right? Things are always related one way or another, so it's better to talk about degrees of relatedness. So examples of this would be, salmon farming in copper-rich Chile, financial services and tourism in Dubai, or the electronic sector in Malaysia. And the last one is financial diversification. So financial diversification consists in investing revenues from commodity extraction in financial assets overseas, right? And then live off the revenues from those investments. So in a way, it involves basically living like a pensioner. And this is done by some countries like Norway, Qatar to some extent, who's investing a lot in France and the UK, but also countries like Chile or Botswana, right, who invest in financial assets overseas through their sovereign wealth funds. So these three types of diversification pathways also entail different roles of the commodity, right? Financial diversification entails the role of the commodity as a source of capital that can be used. Vertical diversification involves the role of commodities as products in a value chain, which you can upgrade to. And related horizontal diversification involves commodities as sources of production capabilities that can be applied to new sectors. The presentation today will be about this part, so the fiscal linkage, right? So how to manage the fiscal revenues from non-renewable resources. In particular, should they be invested in financial assets overseas, or should they be invested to diversify the economy? So first, let's map out the different options for spending resource revenues. First, policymakers need to decide whether resource revenues would be consumed or invested. If they're consumed, that can be through the public sector, so to fuel recurrent government expenditures, public sector salaries, and so on. Or that can be done through private spending. So that involves either conditional transfers, so transfers that are targeted for specific purposes, or consumption subsidies. Or unconditional transfers, so basically the government directly giving out cash to its citizens, or lowered taxes, mostly the Gulf states, right, which tend to have lower taxes than the rest of the world. In states like in Alaska, they also have citizen dividend schemes, whereby each citizen would just receive a lump sum of money from oil extraction. If they are invested, the decision whether to invest resource revenues in financial assets or real assets. If in financial assets, that can be domestically, such as in Malaysia with the Kwan Fund. That's only one of the several funds in Malaysia, or the Algerian Fonds de Régulation des Recettes. If abroad, that can be in safe assets, so low-risk assets for savings purposes. For example, US Treasury bonds, as done by Botswana's Pula Fund or Chile's sovereign wealth funds, or high-yielding assets that may be riskier, but could generate higher returns, such as the Qatar Investment Authority or the Norwegian pension fund, which does a mix of safe assets and high-yielding assets. If invested in real assets, that can be domestically or abroad, if domestically through the public sector or the private sector, if it's through the public sector, that can be for general capabilities, so infrastructure, human capital, or governance capabilities, although some could argue that there's no such thing as general capabilities. Everything, we're doomed to choose. So whatever, even infrastructure or human capital, that may support some sectors more than others. Specific capabilities, so investments that could specifically target the non-resource tradable sector. If those resources are invested through the private sector, that can be, targeted. So that can be perhaps conditional credit upon certain activities. For example, an export subsidy for the export of wind turbines, or general bank lending or general subsidized credit. So these are the different options for managing resource revenues. Now, the standard policy advice, or at least what used to be the standard policy advice, based on the permanent income hypothesis, which was developed by Milton Friedman, is that resource-rich countries should invest their resource revenues in financial assets overseas, and particularly safe assets. Why? Because this can help achieve fiscal stabilization to achieve the effects of commodity price volatility. So it can act as a sort of rainy day fund, right? So you save in those safe assets when you generate a lot of revenue so that you can take some cash out in rainy days. So yeah, living like a pensioner like Norway or Qatar. And this trend of argument has been quite popular, especially because of the perceived risks associated with the other types of managing resource revenues. So the argument is that, well, it's harder to spend resource revenues to fuel consumption because there's a risk of populism, right? This will be used to fuel populist agendas. There's a risk of fiscal instability. So once people get used to higher consumption subsidies, what happens if commodity prices go down? You can't keep living this way, but once consumption habits are entrenched, it's very hard to go back. And the argument as well that investing in real assets domestically are potentially risky because policymakers can misjudge the duration of a commodity boom. This can lead to fiscal instability, so investing more than you should beyond the absorptive capacity of the economy. This can be wasteful, if policymakers don't know what they're doing or they don't have the capacity to invest, or it can lead to elite capture. However, so we need to see those different options as trade-offs, right? There are costs, risks, and benefits. So consumption might be needed in some countries to some extent to tackle a deficit of operation and maintenance, right, of the existing capital stock. Investing in safe assets overseas, financial assets, can help short-term fiscal stabilization, but it's important to remember that investing in financial assets is unlikely to stimulate the productive transformation of the economy. And one could argue that it also pushes the benefits too far into the future. So this discussion in Norway doesn't have the same implication as the same discussion in Nigeria. And lastly, investments in real assets domestically is what is needed to stimulate export diversification. In a way, so the safe assets could be one way to achieve fiscal stabilization, but to achieve long-term export diversification, there is a need for investments in domestic real assets. And countries like Chile and Botswana have often been put forward as the kind of success stories of good management of resource revenues because of their fiscal stabilization program, because of their investment in financial assets overseas. But it's important to bring up the other side of the coin. These are countries that actually there is an excellent paper by Solimano and Calderon on how Chile is actually overinsured. This is a country that has invested copper revenues mostly in financial assets overseas, but actually, so taking into account the savings of the ESF and the central bank reserves, this is about 30% of GDP. So even if it's just about fiscal stabilization, well, they're already insured. At the same time, there's a high opportunity cost because this is a country similarly to Botswana that has relatively high poverty rates, very low domestic investment rates, high unemployment rates, very low R&D, shares of R&D in GDP. So in a way, these countries could also show the opportunity cost of investing in financial assets overseas, especially when it distracts or when it prevents investments in the domestic economy. And thinking about structural transformation too, Botswana in particular, this is a country where well, it's been praised as the kind of success story of diamond revenue management. This is a country where diamond deposits are expected to be exhausted within 20, 30 years. And it represents more than half of the country's exports. So the question is, what happens once diamond revenues run out? So there's a strong case to invest in domestic diversification as opposed to keeping the money in the Zurich, Paris, and London stock market. So in a way, the conventional policy advice is a form of kicking away the resource-based development ladder, because no countries have diversified their economy by just investing resource revenues in financial assets overseas. Now, one thing to add is that obviously the way resource revenues should be managed depends on the objectives that are pursued, right? And there could be different objectives of resource revenue management. It could be fiscal stabilization to smoothen government expenditure, domestic investments to promote diversification, domestic investments just to increase human capital infrastructure, savings for the future generations, or just boosting private consumptions of citizens. However, the interesting thing is how these different objectives relate to one another. So neoclassical models, particularly the permanent income hypothesis, put forward the idea that it's actually through fiscal stabilization that the money can be saved for future generations and enables to boost private consumption because it helps smoothen consumption on the long term, right? And even for future citizens that are not born yet. However, there are other models rooted in structuralist thinking and neo-Marxian thinking that show that actually the best way to increase consumption is through the production of goods. So you need investment in the production of goods to boost private consumption. And on top of things, when we think about intergenerational equity, well, one way to look at it is to just saving the money, right, the cash or stocks for future generations. But another way to think about redistribution for future generations is actually just through growth and diversification. So in a way, if rather than keeping the money for your children or grandchildren, the money has been invested to put the economy on a growth trajectory, your children will be born in a country where that has higher capabilities, higher opportunities, and this is also a way of redistribution. And the other very important factor to add is that the best way to achieve fiscal or macroeconomic stability is not just through short-term fiscal stabilization, but through diversification. And Jonathan Dijon has this fantastic book that I recommend on oil windfalls in Venezuela, in which he shows that countries like Malaysia had actually a much higher public deficit as a share of GDP than even Venezuela for most of its history, from 1970 to 2000. And in in contrast to the advice of the World Bank at the time, who were saying that Malaysian policymakers are overestimating the amount of oil revenues they're getting. But the difference is that in Malaysia, those investments had a long-term transformative impact, right? And because it has led to the diversification of the economy, right? Now there are different sources of income. And after 30, 40 years, the Malaysian economy is far more stable macroeconomically than if they had just invested their monies in financial assets. Other thing to add is that we need to go beyond the one-size-fits-all approach, right? There are many factors that influence, right, the trade-offs between resource revenue management decisions and the suitability of different resource revenue management strategies. The first one is the degree of commodity dependence. So the more a country is dependent on a given commodity, the more urgent diversification becomes. So if you think about countries like Algeria, Angola, Saudi Arabia, or Venezuela, these are countries where oil represents more than 90% of exports, right? So in those countries, the priority should be diversifying away from oil, as opposed to just, short-term fiscal stabilization. Secondly, the savings rates to date. So the current saving rates contributes to the ability of a country to invest domestically as if would be already insured in the case of a commodity price collapse. So in the case of Chile that I had mentioned earlier. The investment deficit, and that includes the low spending on human capital, education, or R&D, which increases the opportunity costs of investing in financial assets overseas, because then the money wouldn't be made available for domestic investments. So that's why it makes a huge difference whether we're talking about Norway, right, which is already relatively developed. So, the opportunity cost of investing in financial assets abroad as they do is much lower than countries like Algeria or Nigeria, where there is a need to invest in domestic infrastructure and human capital. The fourth point is the degree of resource exhaustibility and anticipated price fluctuations. So if resources are to be depleted on the long term, or if their value is to decrease because of changes in either consumer demand or technological innovations, the urgency to diversify the sources of income through diversification increases, right? So now thinking again about the nitrate story in Chile, or countries that are about to run out of oil, right? In those countries, diversifying exports and the source of income is much higher than a country where, let's say, there are more beautiful days ahead, right? Where deposits are not, there's no sign that deposits are going to be exhausted or that prices will go down. The fifth factor is the institutional capacity to invest. So government's ability to spend revenues effectively is affected by the level of institutional development. And the last one is the degree of resource abundance per capita. So what we also find is that the opportunity cost of investment in financial assets overseas is lower for very resource-rich per capita countries, so Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on, than medium resource-rich per capita countries. So countries like Algeria, Nigeria, Chile, Malaysia, and so on, where there is a need for employment generation outside of extractives. So what we mean by that is that for countries where rents are $20,000 per capita, oil rents, they could invest overseas, and the revenues from overseas investments is still enough to fuel domestic consumption or spend on infrastructure. But if you're Nigeria and your oil revenues need to be shared amongst more than 150 million people, as opposed to Norway, well, even if you invest overseas, the money you make from it is still so little that you can't boost consumption or invest for diversification. So the trade-offs are higher. So in terms of the way forward, it becomes clear that the Norwegian solution that has become extremely popular in the resource revenue management debate, the Norwegian solution neglects the role of the diversification of productive structures. It's suitable for Norway, but it's not suitable for most developing countries. So there is a need for a more dynamic approach to those trade-offs across space and time. And this is why we proposed a different approach to managing resource revenues, which is geared in order to overcome the domestic structural constraints, such as to development, so a low technological sophistication, limited areas of competitive advantage, while mitigating the economic risks that are associated with the domestic investment of resource revenues, such as public investment inefficiency, absorptive capacity constraint, and Dutch disease. So this approach is based on two features. The first one is the gradual scale-up of domestic investments in real assets. So nowadays, there is an increasing realization that You can't just spend everything overseas. There are domestic developmental needs that need to be addressed, but there is no consensus on how to do that, how to mix financial investment in financial assets and investments for developmental purposes. Some say, like Paul Collier and others, that you need to wait until you get the capacity to invest before investing domestically. Others suggest that you actually need to weight the potential returns between domestic investments and investments abroad. But what we actually suggest is the best way to do it is a gradual way, right? So the idea that in the first 5 years, that most of the revenues would be invested in financial assets overseas, but over time, more and more revenues would be made available for investments, domestic investments. And this is also in line with the findings by Alan Gelb and his associates, that if you save 80% of resource revenues, that's enough for fiscal stabilization. If you save, and in the case of a short boom, and in the case of a long boom, it's only 20%. If you save more than that, then it has quite a high opportunity cost. The advantage of our approach is that in the case of a short boom, right? So let's say after 7 years, then the income from non-renewable resource revenues drop, then most of the investments, most of the money is still saved in financial assets. But as the boom prolonges and becomes longer, then actually over time, then the stock of investments in productivity enhancing assets increases. So virtually in the short term, so this actually alleviates the cost of potentially misjudging the duration of a commodity boom. Because if it ends up being short, then you save the money, you're fine. If it's a long boom, then you don't have the opportunity cost of having invested everything overseas. The second feature is that the approach focuses on the targeting of productivity enhancing assets for tradable sectors to promote diversification, because in some countries this is the key objective, right? So the approach has several advantages. It's dynamic over time because it enables a gradual shift between short-term fiscalization and long-term accumulation of productive capabilities. Again, we're not saying that short-term fiscal stabilization is a bad thing. It's actually very important. The problem is if you stick to fiscal stabilization, then it distracts attention away from investments that have higher development spillovers. The second aspect is that it takes into account how certain patterns of resource revenue investment can better contribute to increasing the institutional capacity to invest over time. So going back to this idea of you need first the capacity to invest, right? So you don't waste revenues. It is true, but to some extent there is an element of learning by doing or investment experience in the capacity to invest. How are developing countries going to learn how to invest their revenues if they're not investing it, right? If everything is still in financial assets overseas, and suddenly one day they have it, and then they have to invest large sums of money from nowhere. So doing it gradually is actually much better, and it also takes into account the marginal utility of public spending and the issue of absorptive capacity, right? So there's not too much money going in at the same time, but it's a gradual process, and it enables the economy to adjust to absorbing resource revenues. Yeah. So now moving on to the main takeaways. First, well, we need to bring structural transformation back into the resource revenue management debate, right? The stability of different strategies is highly context dependent. The standard policy advice has been dominated by short-termism and the lack of perspective on structural transformation. These approaches have also addressed only the symptoms of commodity dependence, which is the vulnerability to commodity price volatility, but not the root cause, which is the fact that the country is vulnerable to commodity prices because it's insufficiently diversified in the first place. The second thing that we find is that the best fiscal stabilization is economic diversification, right? So the idea of diversifying your sources of income as opposed to just focusing on fiscal rules to buffer the effect of commodity prices. The state has a key role to play in that process in shaping the accumulation of productive capabilities related to the emergence of new exports by reinvesting a share of resource revenues. And then the other point is that in many countries, what policymakers say is that, well, yeah, we would invest the money domestically, but it's not obvious what to do. But this is a real problem because the failure to engage in creative imagination of alternative realities or alternative products that the country could produce that it doesn't produce may lead to maintaining the status quo where the risks are serious and tangible. So again, mentioning the horror stories that I started this presentation with. The management model that we propose, we believe is more suited to the context of commodity-dependent developing countries, and enables to align the dual objectives of short-term stabilization and long-term diversification. Now, I wanted to end this presentation by also addressing the issue of climate change and COVID-19, right? What does that mean for the management of resource revenues? And what can we actually think about reinvesting non-renewable resource revenues towards green industries? So the divestment from fossil fuels has started. Earlier this week, the University of Cambridge announced its net zero plan and that it completely divested from fossil fuels. This is not the first to do it, and it won't be the last. Low carbon innovation is on its way. So what will happen to fossil fuel economies if no serious action is taken? Fossil fuel dependent economies need to undergo a sustainable structural transformation, right? And here I really emphasize the word sustainable because it's not just about nowadays diversifying into anything else than fossil fuel. It needs to be really strategic and in line with the climate change agenda. Why? For several reasons, but one of them is that investing fossil fuel revenues in renewable energies actually can lead to a virtuous circle of diversification. This is particularly the case for countries where there is a high domestic consumption of fossil fuels, either for heating or for cooking or so on. But in those countries, investing in renewable energy means that less fossil fuels are domestically consumed. That means that more of it can be exported, right? And more revenues can be generated from those. And that's particularly important now because if there's a risk of those becoming stranded assets or the prices keeping going down, then it's better to try to export as much now. And that extra money can be used to fuel diversification. And the last one is clean energy deployment is a necessity and becomes a necessity because the demand will increasingly focus on goods and services with low carbon production processes. So let me explain those last 2 points. So this is actually, commodity dependence is intrinsically related to climate change. Why? Because, well, most developing countries, and particularly in Latin America and Africa, are intrinsically linked to climate change because of a dependence either on fossil fuels that are at risk of becoming stranded assets. And by the way, the world in which fossil fuels have a negative value is not unthinkable anymore. Just a few months ago, the West Texas intermediate oil had a negative value. Or agro-commodities, where productivity is vulnerable to fluctuations in temperature and precipitation. So for example, salmon farming in Chile, coffee production in Colombia, or cocoa production in Ecuador. These are sectors where productivity will take a hit because of climate change. So then it's important to think about alternative products that can be promoted. And lastly, the so-called minerals of the future, so copper or lithium. So in some countries that export such commodities, some people think that, well, we don't have any problem with climate change because you need lithium for electric batteries, so we don't need to diversify. But there's still high levels of uncertainty and risks of technological disruption. So nowadays, so thinking again about Fritz Haber, the German scientist, nowadays there is a linkage between lithium and electric batteries, so lithium-ion batteries, but there are billions of R&D being spent on lithium-less batteries, right? Solid-state batteries, phosphate-based batteries. What happens if or when these technologies reach maturity, right, and become more cost-effective than lithium-ion batteries? That's why there is a need to anticipate and diversify your economy to shield yourself from those risks. And the other point is anticipating changes in sustainability standards. Most developing countries, so there's an element of game theory there, because what you should do also depends on what other countries are doing. And the Green Deal proposals in the USA or in the EU do include regulatory changes that will reshape consumption patterns. So developing countries need to anticipate those green trade regulations by shifting their productive capabilities towards greener goods and services if they want to retain market shares in the largest consumer markets. So basically, there's not much room for not going green if everybody's going green. And lastly, there is high potential for employment in renewable energies. So actually, this is the figure for 2018, but IRENA just a few weeks ago published their 2020 report, showing that over 11 million people were employed across the renewable energy sector in recent years. So there is a tremendous job creation potential. One of the issues is that job creation process has been uneven geographically. So Brazil actually retains a relatively good share of renewable energy employment. And because of the potential for job creation in clean technologies, this is where there is a link in today's context of the COVID crisis, right? So the idea of a green recovery that is based on the expansion of renewables and green industrialization could potentially tackle a triple crisis, right? Which is growth and employment, just address, achieve climate goals, and resilience to health problems, because it has been shown that in the context of the pandemic, people recover faster if they have access to cleaner air. And cities that actually suffer from more pollution, the cases have been much worse. So this is how it kind of, the relevance for today's context. To achieve such green recovery, there would be a need to scale up investment in green R&D. But unfortunately, low carbon and R&D levels in general remain quite low in Latin America. Brazil is marginally, the share is higher than the rest of the region, but still, regionally, I mean, the share is extremely low. It's just about a third of the world average. And to end things, sorry, I've been saying that I'm going to end things for a while now. That's why I'm just going to introduce the Canning House research agenda at the Latin American and Caribbean Center at the London School of Economics, which is a 4 to 5 years research agenda. One of the projects will be on the opportunities and obstacles for green deals in Latin America, right? Which is pretty much in light of most of the things that I've already said. There is high imperative for something that looks like a green deal in Latin America for jobs creation, because of high inequality rates and the needs for decent jobs creation, the high need for economic diversification across the board in the region, the anticipated shifts in consumer demand towards sustainable products in the global north, and the high vulnerability to climate change as a result of the commodity dependence in the region. There is a case for regionalization because of synergies and complementarity of assets. So again, even thinking about the wind turbine manufacturing sector, where Brazil is present, Ecuador produces, balsa wood, which is a raw material for wind turbine blades, which most of it is exported to China. Potential with the lithium sector in the Golden Triangle, Brazil's R&D capabilities that could be applied. So there is a case for a regional view, but also substantial obstacles, both economic and political. But these are some of the themes that we'll be addressing through the Canning House research agenda. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm here putting the links to the different resource outputs that I mentioned during the presentation. So the study published by Uniwider, the blog post on the green recovery, and the Canning House Research Forum, where you can find some updates. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amir, for your wonderful presentation. It was really nice to hear you about this topic, about fiscal stabilization and the production diversification as a way on how resource-rich countries and commodity-dependent developing economies could also enhance the trajectory of growth in the long term. Also to have some final remarks on the idea of the green growth and the post-COVID world and the recovery that will be needed to for all countries in the world to thought about it. So thank you so much for these comments too. We are receiving some questions from the audience on YouTube, and also from some professors here at the Institute of Economics. So I will share with you these questions, okay? So everyone who is in the audience and wants to make a question, you can write on the chat on YouTube, and also please mention your name and institution so that we can address the question to Amir. But before these questions, I'd like the prerogative to make a question for you, especially if we think about a certain dichotomy, I think, on short-term and long-term strategies. I think if we take into consideration the political economy issue, I think especially, and also if we look to historical examples in Latin America in the recent commodity boom of the 2000s, there is a kind of trend or tendency for governments to explore the short-term boom in commodity cycles instead of promoting a long-term strategy towards these productivity diversification. So we observed it in some Latin American countries, like the reprimarization of exports and deindustrialization process as quite common in the recent decades, together with the commodity boom cycle. So how do you see this political economy issue on how governments should think in long-term strategies in order to make these more sustainable or sustained, at least, development? You mentioned the case of Malaysia. It seems quite interesting to see how Malaysia did it from the 80s to now, like this more mid-long-term view. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Thanks for that excellent question, Roberto. Yeah, I mean, political factors are really central to these questions, right? In terms of the incentives of policymakers in adopting a long-term vision or not. The first thing to say is, well, one of the general obstacles, especially in democracies, is that a policymaker that has a short mandate of 5 years or less may not really has more incentives in either spending the money as much as possible in a short time to either improve the chances of re-election than having a long-term vision. So one of the key things to say is actually the role of institutions that are beyond just the decision of the executive branch of the government. And by institution, I also mean the social contract with citizens. And that's when also the role of civil society comes into play, because if there is really a strong understanding amongst civil society regarding the kind of the future objectives of resource revenue management, the risks, there can be more pressure for governments to do the right thing in due course. The thing about Malaysia, it's very important to anchor what Malaysia has done in the country's particular historical and ideological and institutional context, right? Malaysia is a country where, I mean, this is also the role of party systems, right? The more parties are stronger, the more a long-term vision is more possible, right? Because there might be uh, some sense of policy continuity. The one thing from Malaysia that is really worth bringing up is the role of their Malaysia plans. So these are 5-year plans that basically have been formulated since independence. There are now 11 of them. And these are plans that detail really well the trajectory of the country and the diversification strategy of the country, right, for 5 years. These are plans that basically they're about 300-400 pages, and they involve many stakeholders, right, in the construction of the plan. But once it's approved, it's a machine that cannot be stopped. All right, and there's at least there's a vision, and on top of these plans, there are also kind of long-term vision plans. But this is basically a map, and even when policymakers change, there's still the understanding that this is where they're actually trying to go, right? This is also a country that had been ruled by Dr. Mahathir for over 25 years. So this also enabled some sense of regime continuity. This is a democracy where the prime minister can be re-elected. There's no limits to the number of mandates. The other extreme would be Chile, when the president of Chile cannot have consecutive mandates, and that has implications in terms of policy continuity. So you had Bachelet, and then Piñera who came back, Bachelet who came back again, and then Piñera. And actually, in the first Piñera government kind of canceled a lot of the Bachelet policies, to the point that the second Bachelet government was a lot more reluctant to putting forward transformative plans, because they knew that if there is a shift to the right, then this would have been done for nothing. So I guess that it involves a lot of different stakeholders, a long-term vision for the country, but also a lot of information, communication to people in civil society regarding what are the objectives to be done for the long term. Why is the money? For the advantage of a gradual approach is that there is a way to kind of trace resource revenue management on the long term, but there is a need to explain why revenues put abroad in the first instance, and the purpose of bringing them and scaling them, and also put some institutional barrier to changing that plan, right? Yeah, does that answer your question, Robert?
Sure. Thank you. I will also now pose a question from the YouTube. We have a question from Tazio Coelho. He's from the Department of Social Science, Federal University of Viçosa, which is another important university here in Brazil. He mentions, he has two questions indeed. So in the paper, I'll translate for you. In the paper, the proposal of using the revenues of natural resources comes from the national or federal scale, no? Which would be the main differences in using these revenues in the regional or provincial or state scale, like in a big country like Brazil, and the management of resources, part of this resource made by each state, each province. So, and the second question from him is how to include in these proposals the dimensions of distribution of income and the good life. So how to fight against inequalities, and how to incorporate this issue in this agenda that you are proposing.
Great, yeah. That's two very good questions by Professor Coelho. The first one on the implications of resource revenue management at the provincial level. So I guess this will depend on each country and their institutional layout, right? But for example, Malaysia is also a federation, in which some money goes back to oil producing states. There's a large debate on the benefits of localization or not. I think here the main discussion first is the kind of also social contract, right? Whether oil's share of the oil revenue should go back to the provincial states or not. In some countries it's the case, in others not. For example, Botswana, because of the idea that, at the time everyone benefits from pooling resources together, especially because they didn't know where they would find more diamond mines or not, right? So this way everybody is guaranteed a share of resource revenues, as opposed to resource producing states having an advantage over others. So beyond this, then the question of, it also depends on the different factors I listed. And I guess the same thinking could be applied at the provincial level, in terms of the existing institutional capacity to invest. The one consideration to add is that, to which extent they are national development plans, and also depends on the developmental needs of each country. But to what extent they are the developmental priorities of the country needs to be solved at the national level. For example, if there is a large-scale move towards hydrogen, right, and that requires billions of investment, then it's probably better for the central government to be able to pull that money together, as opposed to provincial level governments to basically trying to do the same things, but with a small share of the revenues they got. To take it to the other extreme is the distribution at the individual level, which you didn't mention, but perhaps is part of that same thinking of localization. Some say that individuals could be better than policymakers or central government at identifying investment opportunities. However, the big issue is what you can do as an individual, and maybe to some extent at the province. But again, depends on the country. Some provinces, like in Brazil, this is basically the size of a state, right? In other countries, a province is basically not bigger than a municipality. But the question is, or would those revenues be enough to actually have large-scale macroeconomic impact, right? If we're talking about a complete decarbonization of the economy, then yeah, you can't really just assume that this is going to happen just by giving money to individuals, because they might also, and that also happens at the provincial level, they might prioritize maybe investments for consumption, or again, going back to the whole re-election issue, as opposed to investment that might have a long-term impact. And lastly, the thing about redistribution is that there is a case for kind of redistributing revenues for resource producing states, but there's also an issue of equity, right? What about if states where perhaps this is where the poor segments of the population are located, this may be a resource poor states. So this also creates a case for redistribution from one state to another. In terms of the second question, this is also a very important question. And actually, the Canning House Research Forum, these are 3 project cycles. The first one addresses the nexus between inequality, diversification, and taxation. And the way it relates to inequality is because depending on the country, right, and each country that has inequality may have different causes of inequality. But in commodity-dependent countries, it seems that very often inequality is driven not just by a lack of redistribution, but by a lack of employment opportunities, a lack of labor absorption of the poorest segments of the population. And that's particularly for commodity-dependent countries, because if you depend on oil extraction, right? I mean, extractive industries in general are not labor-intensive, right? Which means that even if you double production, you're not employing twice as many people. And diversification is a way to expand employment opportunities for people and integrate more people into the labor market. And so in the first project, so there are quantitative analysis of the effect of diversification on inequality, and it is found that diversification has an impact on inequality reduction, and also through taxation, because then the more you diversify your economy, the more you stabilize revenues from taxation, right? Because then revenues from taxation are not volatile, are kind of decoupled from commodity prices. And also, I mean, there's a clear correlation as well between diversification and tax per capita. And with that revenues that can be reused towards social programs and in poverty reduction programs. So diversification is intrinsically related to inequality reduction.
Thank you very much, Amir. And two very important topics here mentioned by Professor Coelho. Thanks for the question too. Now we have a question from Antonio Carlos Diegues, professor at the Institute of Economics, Unicamp, which is already in English, so I'll read it for you. I would like to hear some impressions of Professor Amir about the constraints to absorb and operate the use of the resource revenues when the production and distribution chains are led by foreign companies. So foreign companies leading this process. In other words, despite the great potential of generating important indirect linkage and dynamism, an important fraction of the value added is, on the one hand, related to the use of inputs that are developed and traded by global companies like Syngenta, Monsanto, and others, and on the other hand, appropriated by trading or non-national trading companies that controls the distribution chains. So,
thank you very much. That's a very, very good and very relevant question. So it seems that, sorry, it sounds like I'm kind of advertising different papers every time, but there's a research that I recently worked with Kun Lee and Carlo Pietrovelli that kind of looks at the role of ownership in resource-based industrialization. And what we found is that ownership is a key determinant of vertical integration diversification. In sectors that are dominated by foreign companies, there are far less forward and backward linkages, exactly because of what Professor Diegues just mentioned. Foreign companies may prefer to use either their international suppliers, right, for quality, to ensure quality or reliability, or because these are already the suppliers that they've been working with. They have less incentive in betting on local innovators, although there are some exceptions. And also from a kind of different context, the context of resource-based development in Malaysia across 3 commodities, oil, palm oil, and rubber, when these industries were dominated by foreign companies, there was no interest for value addition. Why? Because the main centers of value addition and processing were in Europe, and the interest was just to extract the raw material, right? So they don't necessarily have incentives for local value addition. And the interest to increase value only increased after the kind of nationalization of these industries and through strong industrial policy tools. So industrial policy tools such as so if you leave it to the free market, there's no incentives for these companies to invest locally. But policy tools including subsidies export subsidies for value-added taxes, for value-added products, R&D support for value addition, and sometimes just the ban of crude oil export or crude palm oil exports. These are things that contributed to increase linkages to the domestic economy. But it's also important to know that there are also exceptions, and I think the Chilean mining sector is one exception. So in the 70s, when Codelco was national, so the mining company was nationalized, there was a boost for local suppliers, right? The anticipation that there will be more business opportunities for local firms. Now the sector has been dominated by foreign companies, but what is extraordinary is that most of the efforts for value addition is coming from foreign companies, not even the mining company, because in a context of a lack of industrial policy support or interest in value addition. So managers in the national oil company are basically have no interest in pursuing value added because there's no policy environment to support it, right? They would rather import goods from foreign suppliers that are reliable, and they cannot basically be called off for doing this, as opposed to, but if they bet on a strategy on a local innovator and it goes wrong, then this is where they risk their position. And most of the efforts actually are coming from the Australian company BHP Billiton, because they had realized, but that's a particular context. It's a context of the biggest copper exporters, potentially economies of scale, because they realized that they could potentially reduce costs if they bet on local suppliers. But what this shows is that ownership matters, but the policy context too, and you need both to pursue linkage development. And this actually kind of is in line with Professor Alice Tamsden, who passed away a few years ago. Unfortunately, her initial argument of the fact that multinational companies could be a great way to boost initial industrial development, but they can hinder the process of value addition on the long term if countries still rely on multinational corporations as opposed to try to promote indigenous capabilities.
Thank you very much, Amir. GX, do you want to comment? It's fine. So thanks also for mentioning your paper with Kyung Lee and Pietro Belli. It was very interesting topic as well. So it's another reading to recommend our audience to have a look at. I'll have also a question from Professor Alex Paludetto. He wrote, I'd like to hear Professor Amir on the strategy of international reserve accumulation recently adopted by several peripheral economies. How do you evaluate this strategy that seems at the same time to protect these countries from instability and to limit their capacity for structural change through the use of these resources in dollars?
Okay, are there countries in particular that are of interest, or kind of more generally?
Alex, do you I think more in the Latin American case, like in the...
Yes, in the Latin American economies, I'm thinking about this strategy and about your framework, how this strategy can be understood within your framework.
Yeah. So accumulating reserves internationally can be a good thing, as long as it doesn't prevent funds being channeled towards domestic diversification. Now, the reason I ask about particular countries is that really depends which country we're talking about. If this is a country that is already diversified, already has relatively high domestic investment rates, and they're also saving money abroad, then yeah, I mean, that investment can only be good. It doesn't have much opportunity cost. But if we're talking about countries like most Latin American countries, especially Ecuador or even Chile in particular, I mean, these are countries that are already overinsured, right? So the idea that they need to insure themselves again even more, I mean, not Ecuador, but at least Chile, with the accumulation of reserves abroad in the context when there is a huge social crisis, huge inequality, tremendous poverty for a country that is an OECD country, then this is when the accumulation of assets overseas really has a huge opportunity costs. But that goes back to also Roberto's point on the short-term and long-term vision of politicians, that the domestic investments that can have a transformative impact, they take decades, right? And very often this is not what policymakers that have a 5-year time horizon have in mind. And yeah, the other thing to also mention in terms of the COVID crisis is it also kind of complicates resource revenue management in terms of how to spend it, the immediate concerns. I mean, actually, your point, Ecuador is actually an interesting country to discuss, because this is a country that had taken an IMF loan and that decided to repay it at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, that decision has been controversial because it also goes into priorities. Obviously, you should try to pay your debt, but in the context of pandemic, shouldn't you rather address immediate priorities in terms of health and security, rather than repaying the IMF loan? And yeah, this is kind of a discussion that is that mirrors the discussion on cash reserves abroad.
Thank you, Amir. Thanks, Alex, for the question. We also have a question from Renan Araújo, who is a PhD student at Unicamp. He would like to ask you, Amir, on how to conduct the economic development considering the big state oil enterprises, without promoting a kind of setback in the development of renewable energy sources in the countries. I would also to take this issue and ask you about the how, like, oil exporting countries in the Middle East, for instance. I don't know if you are following how they are, if they have some strategies in terms of the energy transition and the green growth you mentioned, which kind of in the long term.
So yeah, that's also a very important question. So the first thing to say about oil production is, well, there are many things to say. The first one is, first, policymakers need to carefully assess, and not just policymakers, actually, civil society as a whole, the true value of oil resources. And that also depends for the context of each country, but there could be countries that have oil reserves in which it actually makes no sense to extract oil now, right? Even economically, because the environmental concerns, they can be internalized in the kind of monetary value or anticipated monetary value of oil. So if this is a country that has some oil reserves, but you know that there are big risks of oil becoming a stranded assets, if you apply the eventuality of carbon taxes, does oil extraction still remain viable? The other thing to add is, there are contexts in which, well, you can extract oil with the very little loss of opportunity income. There are places where if you extract oil, you're destroying other sources of income, either agriculture income, tourism income in some places. So then it's really about, okay, well, this is the value of oil, but if you take off all the opportunity income, plus the cost of carbon taxes, plus the risk of stranded assets, does it actually make sense, right? So this is the first thing to discuss. And for many countries, it might not make sense to produce oil anymore. For the others, if it still makes sense, the thing is, there will still be potentially demand for oil, for petrochemicals, for the pharmaceutical sectors, and so on. Now, in terms of the setback for renewable energies, as I mentioned, the thing is, the oil extraction itself, there's now the whole discussion on green oil. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but and green oil as well as blue oil. So this is oil where extraction methods involve lower carbon processes or less carbon intensive. So Saudi Arabia recently shipped its first blue ammonium shipment to Japan. The question whether this is sufficient, in the context of climate change is, I mean, there are reasons to remain skeptical, but the idea is that there is oil extraction and there is oil extraction, right? And there are ways to reduce the impact of oil as part of international commitments and still make revenues from it. And then the idea is the revenues from it, how are they spent? and that there is a strong case for especially oil-dependent countries to invest in renewables. And they're investing, so there's also the discussion that, or this perception that fossil fuel countries, they have less incentives in the energy transition, because obviously they benefit from oil extraction. But the truth is, if they look at it from a more strategic angle, they should invest in renewables because they're fossil fuel dependent, right? And there are strong linkages between the two. So I mentioned some transversal linkages, but also in terms of the investment of the money. If you invest oil money in renewables, that even just enables you to make more money from fossil fuel exports, but also enables you to reuse that for diversification or for funding renewable energy expansion. In the Middle East, I mean, there are some renewable, the energy transition has been on the agenda for a very long time, but with, let's say, different outcomes across the region. In Algeria, there's been some investments in renewable energy plants, but also in the kind of the manufacturing part of it. So there are centers that are dedicated to clean technologies and so on, but very little commercialization to date. Morocco has spent a lot, but I mean, Morocco is not, it's a phosphate-rich country, but not an oil-rich country, has scaled up renewables. Saudi Arabia as well. I think Saudi Arabia at some point hit the lowest price of solar energy. So there are some efforts, but for fossil fuel countries, I think the main challenge is to do it in a smart way, in which you don't reinvent the wheel, right? You don't start from scratch, but you actually use the capabilities previously acquired in fossil fuel extraction towards clean energies.
Thank you, Amir. Thanks. I would also like to pose a final question. I think from the audience, we don't have any other questions. So I would like to ask you about the idea of green growth, especially thinking about the Brazilian case. The Brazil is a country whose exports are concentrated mostly on some agriculture and mineral goods, basically soybeans, iron ore, and oil. Of course, many other agriculture goods, sugar, coffee, and so on. Meat, chicken, so on. We export for different countries. China is the largest trade partner. And recently, probably you have been observing all the questions about the deforestation of Amazon, Pantanal, some regions, important regions, not only for Brazil, but for the whole world. There's a huge and increasing concern, I think, from different countries, the international community, about what's going on in terms of environmental policy in Brazil and so forth. So I would like to hear you a bit on this connection between the agriculture, because Brazil is a leading country in terms of production and exports of food for different countries, and commodities in general. So and the deforestation. So how to deal with these, combine the agriculture issue to promote a green growth. I think we can do that. We have assets to do that, but maybe it's lacking some strategy. So could you comment on this, please?
Yeah. So this is, I have to say, Roberto, this is unfair as a last question, because it's a $1 million question that probably could take an hour of discussion. But well, the few things to say first about green growth and Brazil's existing exports. I think something that's very important is to look towards the future and think, what is the impact of climate change on Brazil's current exports, and what are the risks of maintaining the status quo? So talking about industrial policy, but also green industrial policy, the critiques always say, yeah, but industrial policy involves a lot of risks. potentially very high cost of taxpayers' money, and sometimes it fails. And that's all true. Nevertheless, when you think about the alternative, and what's the risk of not doing nothing and keeping producing the same thing we produce, and the risk is actually much higher. And it's actually, the risk is actually guaranteed. Because if you lose agricultural income because of climate change, if you can't export your oil anymore because it becomes a stranded assets, then yeah, actually you're heading straight towards the wall. So it's worth taking the risks towards green industrial policy and green industries. The discussion on deforestation is very, very important because, and that goes back to the point you were bringing up about the short-term versus long-term horizon. This, on the long run, will have very dramatic consequences for Brazil, but also the rest of the world. If you think about carbon taxes and many other things, but also the truth is the debate on exploitation of forests, or the exploitation of biodiversity versus conservation, has been very dichotomous, right? Saying either one or the other. And actually, there are other ways that one could think about biodiversity, right, as an alternative to deforestation. Actually, so one of the projects as part of the Cunning House Forum is on biomimicry. So the idea of, can Latin America leverage its biodiversity as a source of inspiration for low carbon innovation through biomimicry? And this would be a way to see biodiversity, not just in terms of what can we extract from it, or do we just conserve it, but then what's the alternative, right? People talk about ecotourism, but the truth is this is not enough to sustain livelihoods. I mean, you might create some jobs, but you might get some German tourists that come every now and then, but that's not really a sector with much value added and spillovers. One of my colleagues at the LSE actually looked at the impact of the conservationist agenda in the Amazon, showing that it still leaves indigenous people worse off because they lose income, they lose jobs from the shops they have and the catering and so on. So then there's a real question on what is the value of, let's say, the environmental assets that you're destroying through deforestation. And in that case, I also have to say that this is the Amazon is an asset that it would be unfair to put the cost of preserving the Amazon, or at least the opportunity cost of preserving the Amazon region, only on Brazil and Brazilians, because everyone benefits from the Amazon and cleaner air and carbon capture, but only Brazil would suffer the consequences of not being able to extract the Amazon's resources, right? So I think there is a case for a serious compensation for, let's say, protecting the environment. And that's something that was actually attempted in Ecuador by President Correa. When he came to power, the idea was, so most of Ecuador's oil is located in the Yasuni National Park, which is the most biodiverse region in Ecuador, and one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. So his proposal was that Ecuador will not exploit the oil in the Amazon region and will maintain it if the international community compensates Ecuador for a third of the money they would have made if they extracted oil. But no one paid, right? There's a lack of international frameworks to allow for this. And in the end, the initiative failed and Ecuador started to drill. But I think there is a serious discussion to have on if there is environmental assets that, let's say, to avoid deforestation, then what's the alternative source of income that can be used to sustain livelihoods? And if not, then there is a serious case for compensation by the international community who benefits from such decisions.
Thank you so much, Amir, for your talk and for answering our questions. We are very pleased to have you here today. So hopefully, as we are running out of time, next time we will have the seminar in person in Brazil, hopefully soon. And it was
thank you very much.
It was a very pleasure time. It goes too fast, 1 hour and a half, and we have enjoyed a lot. I think all answers and all professors were here could enjoy your talk, and there's a lot of research, to potential research also to do together. I think Unicamp can contribute a lot to it, especially in the Brazilian case.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you so much.
I think the Q&A session. Yeah, I think the Q&A session opened more questions than answers, but I guess that's a good thing. Thanks very much for hosting me, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to the email I wrote for further discussions. And yeah, it was a real pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much. And for the audience, also we would like to thank you for following us on YouTube. And also, if you want to see any recordings or other webinars the Institute of Economics has promoted over this time, they are available online on YouTube. So people can follow the page on YouTube and on Facebook if they want to keep following the discussions of the Institute of Economics at Unicamp. Thank you. Bye-bye for everyone.
Thank you. Obrigado. Nice to meet you all.